Thank you, Hans. I was going to say good afternoon to all, but given the nationalities on board, I think it's a good day because for some it's evening or very early morning or night, I think. It's a pleasure to be able to present on this topic. It's work in progress as part of a project that is being conducted for the User-Centered Energy Systems Technology Collaboration Program by the International Energy Agency. And what we do in this project, or annex, as projects are actually called under the program, is work together with 4 countries, the Netherlands, Ireland, Sweden, and Australia. And in each country, we have national experts who help us perform the work and the research. I have so much that I would like to share with you, but given the time constraint and the overarching picture that I would like to sketch of our work, it will be an overarching presentation. For any details, contact me or go online. I will tell you where to find anything in addition. So to introduce the work I present today builds upon a previous phase of this same research that ran for a few years until 2018. But let me give you a brief summary of that work first, since it forms the building blocks for the work we are doing now on entrepreneurship in the energy transition. If you want to learn more again about this first set of results that I'm going to very briefly discuss, I refer to our project website. You will be able to find many reports, webinars, PowerPoints, etc. there. So why did we start our research? Well, we started from the observation that there is an enormous urgency on the one hand to deliver new innovations, both technological as well as social innovations, to accelerate the energy transition. And this sense of urgency is also felt by many entrepreneurs, and a lot of them expect it to lead to new big business opportunities. And although some do become big and successful businesses, many never outgrow their experimental stage and are actually still waiting for their big breakthrough. So what we wanted to do is actually learn how the business models that are being used, but also the skills, or they're also called dynamic capabilities of these entrepreneurs, explain the uptake of their new energy innovations or the lack thereof. The first key question that guided our previous work was if more user-centered and more service-oriented business models and energy services were also more effective in delivering energy solutions and having a good market uptake compared to the others that are more technocratic, technology push type of business models. And this question originated from the appreciation that the energy transition is actually also, well, many other transitions, but also a transition in the energy sector in the ways we do things. And this is a transition from a product orientation where everything is focused on a one-off transaction, selling a product, installing a measure and getting out. Where the entrepreneur does not focus on the use of the innovation towards a more service and therefore also by definition more user-centered orientation, where actually the use phase is considered at least as relevant and also therefore becomes the focus of the value proposition. I'll get back to that in a minute. Actually, we think that this servitization transition is one of the grand and overlooked challenges in the energy business development area. It's actually also key to successful uptake. So to illustrate what the difference is between a service and a product, let me use this example. All of you know this drilling machine. In a product push approach, you sell a drilling machine to a customer. This machine is sold with a description in terms of outputs related to the technology specs, like the strength and the RPMs of this machine, or how big the holes are that you can make, etc. And of course, how cheap it is compared to other drilling machines. So the business model is very much also internally about the financial efficiency, which means that those selling this drilling machine want to do it at the lowest cost with the highest margins. And the value they sell to you actually only exists up to the moment you buy it. As soon as you have bought a product, the value is starting to be destroyed, and nothing stays at the same price level in a product-oriented model. And the role of the user, you and me in this case, is passive. We have a take it or leave it, and perhaps do a bit of research type of relationship with the business developer and the ones selling the machines. But we're actually only needed for the transaction, for the buy. A service is about the solution, about the job to be done by the service. It's about making sure that, in this case, the painting is put on the wall in such a manner that it is exactly how the user wants to use it. So it's about solutions. And the value delivered is what actually matters as outcome to us, the users. So in that sense, our role as users in a service approach is much more key. And perhaps more importantly even, and especially in the energy sector, this becomes more and more apparent, it's actually in the use phase that the value becomes felt, is experienced, and comes into existence. And actually, the use phase very often also changes the value, sometimes increasing the value of the service. Therefore, it's really important that the user and the use phase are part and parcel of this more service-oriented approach. And of course, services also use technologies, but the technologies are an enabler for the service, instead of what you sometimes see when there's a product push, that the service is actually an enabler to deliver the product. So the field of energy efficiency or reduction, demand flexibility, renewable energy, whatever you're working on, would, we think, and has been evidenced also, greatly benefit from this servitization transition. And to be honest, I'm sure most of you will recognize then that in many cases, a lot of the energy solutions out there that are treated as some kind of high-tech product, like the smart meters with the feedback displays, smart thermostats, etc., are in fact already a combination of technology and services, and perhaps even more service than technology. And that brings me to the second result that we found. We also wanted to investigate whether the setup of the business model mattered for the uptake. So what you see here is the business model as developed by Osterwolder, Pineur, and partners. We use this one, we've had many questions about it, because it's one of the business model canvases that most of the entrepreneurs working in the field out there are actually using. So it was the best way to communicate. And of course, every type of business model canvas has its limitations. We knew that, but we made sure that we were aware of it. So what we tried to investigate is how a business model delivering a product actually looks like, and how different it is from a business model delivering a service. And we found that there is a lot of difference. Most notably, perhaps, as I mentioned before, the relationship and the activation and the channels being used for the customers are completely different. Actually, customers are more partners than anything else. Instead of clients even, but also of course the whole revenue system, so what comes in terms of value is very much different, and as I said before, most service-oriented business models are very much also focusing on the use phase instead of merely until transaction, so until something has been bought. What we found is too much to tell you now. I don't have the time to go into detail, but the message that I really want you to keep in mind is that we found that entrepreneurs that understood that if you deliver a service, you actually also need a service business model, are more successful than those that use a product-oriented business model to deliver a service. And this may sound trivial to you, but we actually found that many services being delivered as products and vice versa, products being delivered as services still exist out there. And those type of business models that are incoherent in a way experienced more uptake issues than those that are coherent. And it's not so much that we are saying that either product or service is better. We need both in the energy transitions, but it's really imperative that the business model used to deliver them must match to be efficient. The third question that we ask ourselves and that we found in this previous phase is that capabilities of entrepreneurs and providers of services matter. And especially capabilities which allow for a focus on the customer perspective or the user-centeredness that is needed. And that helps actually tailoring the service to really become the job to be done for the variety of customers. The better those capabilities were developed, the more successful the uptake of the product or service was. And we actually found that a bad fit between many business models and their intended users, which leads to a bad uptake, is of course to some extent understandable if we realize that most of the companies in the field originate from really passionate people that have been developing some technology, are absolutely sure it's the answer to whatever problem is out there. And by definition, of course, operate from a product push approach instead of really understanding the users and what is of value to them. So what we found, and we worked on this with workshops, etc., is that for those entrepreneurs to become more capable of actually delivering what the users wanted, they would need to not only adjust the business model they were using, but they also would need to train or develop a specific set of skills. And we found the following four of key importance. They are also called dynamic capabilities for servitization. And there is a beautiful, rich field of literature focusing on this. Authors like Den Hartog and Janssen are very much at the front in discussing these. So the first capability that matters very much for the uptake is sensing, and that is the ability to continuously retrieve relevant insights from the end users and other stakeholders. The second is conceptualizing, which is the ability to actually translate what you found during your sensing operations into relevant insights and into usable propositions or adjustments to your proposition if you started from, for example, a product push approach. The third one becomes increasingly important when we talk about smart technologies, smart systems, smart homes, etc., system integration. It's orchestration. It's the ability to provide a seamless experience to the end user, both in the orientation phase, before purchasing, during purchasing, but also the use phase. And this very often requires other forms of cooperation with multiple partners. All of them need to be aligned. And this skill is extremely important to be effectively system integration, to be effective at system integration. And then the last skill or dynamic capability is the stretching/scaling capability. So stretching is the ability to actually create an organizational structure internally that supports all the other capabilities and your business model. And scaling, I don't really need to explain it, and I will come back in more detail to this skill later on, is the ability to tap into new niches and to be able to anticipate developments and do an iterative turn of, for example, again, sensing, conceptualizing, and orchestrating. What all of this amounted to is that we were able to identify four business model and skill archetypes in the energy transition. I'm not going to go into detail there today. Again, all of this in much detail can be found online on our project website. But what I do want to say is that the better the business model was focused on the user, the more user-centered the business model was, and the better the four capabilities that I discussed just now were developed, the better the uptake in the market. And this is not something that can only be found in the energy transition. Actually, servitization has been very successfully developed already in many other sectors, like the telecom sector, but also many others, including, for example, also the health sector. What we also investigated, and that's the bridge to the next phase and next part in that sense of this presentation, is whether or not a better alignment of the business model with the broader system, so making sure it fits with, for example, existing legislation, regulations, institutions, etc., was helpful in delivering the energy solutions more effectively. And we focused explicitly on this because it's apparent from both practice and theory that business models are very much shaped and influenced by the system that they operate in, and by the various players, of course, in that energy system. And we did find some initial strategies in how the entrepreneurs dealt with the system and how they adapted their business model to fit the system or create a good match, or even try to stretch the system instead of adjusting or adapting their business model. But we needed to investigate this more. So to conclude, what we found in this first phase, and which is the building block for what we are investigating now, is that those companies that have made the adjustments towards service orientation indeed report a better uptake, and therefore are more successful than companies that have a product-oriented business model. And that this requires also the four dynamic capabilities of sensing, conceptualizing, orchestrating, and scaling. But as I said, we had one big question that we didn't feel we were able to delve into enough, and that was how to make sure that those business models and entrepreneurs that we think have great potential to support the acceleration of the energy transition are more effectively supported by policy and or other institutional arrangements, such as certification, the banking system, etc. And that led us to the second part of our research, where we wanted to investigate how innovative energy services scale up, how their business models and also entrepreneurial journeys are shaped by the system around them, and then specifically also by this system being in transition, which makes it a different type of system than merely a system that is stable. How those entrepreneurs or enterprising stakeholders deal with the system, and which kind of dynamic capabilities next to the servicing one that we found might have a positive or negative impact on their successfulness. And then we were aiming to actually identify what this means in terms of the system conditions that should be in place to facilitate the flourishing of those services. So just to give you really 1 minute of methodological grounding, we started out with a long list of cases in the 4 countries that participate, then narrowed it down to a short list based on what we felt were interesting cases based on the results from the first phase. And then we started interviewing the entrepreneurs and the system stakeholders about the business model, their capabilities, etc. Flanked it with a literature review, for which I thank our intern very much as well. And we are now in the analysis phase. We shortlisted in the end 21 case studies. And what we found is that those case studies were well, ranging from microgrids to community virtual power plants to normal virtual power plants to community sustainable districts to light as a service, PV as a service, demand response and flexibility services, heat as a service type of business models. And I will come back to these cases or a selection of these cases in a few minutes with more detail. But let me first describe a bit more the specific context that these entrepreneurs actually have to operate in. The first characteristic that is typical for a system in transition, because remember, we are investigating entrepreneurs in the energy transition, so also in the context of a system in transition, is that there is a lot of complexity and interwovenness of dimensions, actors, skills, etc. Everything is connected to each other, and that also helps keep the system stable for as far as possible. But that also means for an entrepreneur, if they really want to provide a service that is to some extent different and accelerating the energy transition, so by definition, challenging in a way the existing system, they would need to also not only change technology and infrastructure, but also norms, culture, regulations, institutions, knowledge, etc. A second characteristic which makes life quite difficult for entrepreneurs in the energy transition is that there are more uncertain pathways than any clear directions. So most of the situation out there for entrepreneurs is one where policy is actually not making clear choices in terms of vision, direction, etc. And this is really challenging, of course, because if you want to develop a proposition, a new innovation, demand needs to trust in that innovation, and for it trust, it needs to see how this innovation is going to contribute to the future. The third element, which complicates the life of entrepreneurs, is that because of this complexity, this uncertainty, the interwovenness of everything, which makes that if you change something in one corner of the system, there will be changes in another corner of the system. There is a lack of governance, also called organized irresponsibility by the sociologist Ulrich Beck in another context. But what it amounts to is that there is actually not one single actor able, capable and willing to take well, the leading role and define where to go. And then, because everything is complex, uncertain, etc., it's also a situation of loss in translation, conflicting paradigms, different perspectives that this type of entrepreneur needs to work in. And that is extremely challenging. For example, entrepreneurs experience great tensions between, on the one hand, sustainability versus affordability. Many institutions, such as insurances, banks, accountants, they operate according to the old paradigm. And because of that, innovative new business models have a really hard time finding capital or cannot be easily insured or accounted for, etc. And finally, the last characteristic of this transition is that there is resistance. The system works very hard to keep the status quo, and innovations that help optimize the system, they fit easily, but anything that's more radical experiences strong resistance. So how do the entrepreneurs that we have been focusing on react to this characteristic of the energy transition? Well, what we see happening in practice is that there are different entrepreneurial strategies, from ignoring, which is the left-hand top, to resisting the system, left down, to following the flock right up, to actually trying to somehow navigate the system in a smart, safe way with smart alliances. But there are also entrepreneurs, and those are the ones that I want to focus on more closely today, that actually try to reconfigure the system and try to lead the way to a new system. And when we come back to the 21 cases, those in purple are actually, in one way or the other, very much this last category of entrepreneurs, the ones that aim to reconfigure the system, change institutions, regulations, etc., and be leaders in developing a new system. There are 7 that to some extent fall into this category, and let me give you a few examples. First, we have a third generation owner of a company that advises and installs all type of energy measures and installations in the Netherlands. Jan, who is the owner, is a very savvy entrepreneur, trained in business economics. He runs the company with his 2 brothers, and he very much wants to be a leader. Because he sees that the competition is going to be too tough. There will need to be a lot of change realized in the system. So he decided to start an ESCO company just before the crisis in 2008. And this ESCO offers warmth as a service type of propositions. What makes Jan very different is that he very quickly realized that this ESCO model was perhaps too soon in the market. But instead of ignoring the system or trying to navigate it, he actually tries to turn all of the challenges that he encounters into a win-win that favors his business model. He even started educating or training those actors within banks who have to deal with his new model or the type of model that he also wants to implement. And as such, change the educational system and the knowledge base to create trust and acceptance for his model. There are other examples, but just to give you an example from the Netherlands. So we also have an Irish example, which is a project started by Veolia, a global resource management company that developed an EPC service for hospitals with the explicit proposition to, in a way, also be an ESCO by managing the project, covering the design, the delivery, the installation, the commissioning, and the operation of a wide range of energy upgrades in hospitals. They were quite successful in acquiring long-term energy infrastructure project agreements, for example, with a hospital in Dublin. And this company experienced a very big challenge in the context of Ireland, which is that for new business models around EPC and ESCOs, the biggest challenge is not financial, but it's about distribution of risks, insurance issues, and trust issues with respect to the process. And they felt that policy can help by creating trust in intermediaries that can act as agnostics and neutral parties in this process. What's most interesting about this case is actually the Carbon and Energy Fund Ireland that was created to actually deliver energy performance contracts on behalf of Ireland's public hospitals. And this fund actually helps, brokering, mediating between hospitals and EPC providers by solving issues around trust, finance, and insurance. So in Ireland, ESCOs and EPCs are an emerging market, and this project was very much aimed at creating a supportive environment for ESCO facilitators by, again, building trust in the service and aligning actors to further build a supportive environment. So orchestration as a skill, but also another skill, which is much more about strategic alliances, is very clearly demonstrated in this case. Then we have a Swedish case called Engenic. It's a case about a smart thermostat, and you would think, why is a smart thermostat an interesting transition entrepreneurial case? Well, although they focused, of course, on the smart thermostat type of actions, what they actually aimed to do is provide a portal to deliver flexibility services between households and a grid operator. And they did so explicitly to create experiments that would demonstrate the feasibility of peak reduction, because a lot of changes still need to be put in place in the Swedish system to allow for this type of flexibility service to emerge at all. As in many countries, the benefits and the costs of flexibility services and other services focused on reduced loss factor, they are not taking place effectively or equitably or transparently. And the calculation of what the value actually is of the flexibility is insufficiently taking place. And Engenic is explicitly aiming to generate discussion on the new roles and forms of engagement, ownership structures, etc. In Sweden. And then we have two final cases from Australia. The first one is MIMO, which is about a electricity microgrid operator on a university campus of Monash University. This university started this microgrid project explicitly with the aim to challenge the existing energy institutions and experiment with new models in terms of ownership structures and value calculation for flexibility services and balancing services. And this makes this case extremely important and relevant to study. And then we also have a community or grassroots initiative from Australia called Yakadanda. I see there's a K missing. Yakadanda is more than the traditional type of grassroots initiative, because this one aims to change the institutional conditions in Australia, specifically focused at making sure that there is this tendency to think that decentralization comes automatically with democratizing the users. But that's not the case. And this case explicitly investigates how democratization can occur alongside with decentralization. And also it aims to demonstrate that actually, like with a lot of demand response trials, it's actually the households that are delivering a public service and value to the network. And as such, there should be also value flowing back to them for that, just as the Engenic case demonstrates. So what these cases are, and what makes them extremely relevant, is that they are a different type of entrepreneurship than what we see mostly. These are, if we have to give a definition, which is difficult because there's not yet a lot of consensus on what the definition for this type of entrepreneurship is, starts with naming it. And one of the names that is being used is institutional entrepreneurship. This type of institutional entrepreneurs are individuals or organizations or a group of individuals or organizations that have a very particular institutional interest and that actually explicitly aim to disrupt the existing system or so-called socio-technical configuration, change elements of this system and reconfigure, or at least create new, or not at least reconfigure, or even create a totally new type of configuration. And this type of entrepreneur is very different from the other types. Let me give you a very quick example. The first type of entrepreneur is the strategic entrepreneur. They're very much defined, and their business model as well, by the existing socio-technical system. They know how to operate in a complex and dynamic and therefore changing environment, but they do not aim to challenge the existing system. They aim at scaling up by maneuvering as smartly as possible. And here we also return to some extent to the dynamic capabilities that I mentioned earlier, sensing, conceptualizing, orchestrating, stretching, and scaling. This type of entrepreneur has and applies these skills very well on the level of individuals and organizations, and in addition brings technical skills, business management skills, etc. to the table. Then we have grassroots initiatives, which are also in a sense a type of institutional entrepreneurship. They are very much often local, community-led, of course, and very much embedded in the existing system, but not very much defined by it. It aims to change the system, but on a local level, so not reconfiguring the system as a whole. So they do challenge the system, but they don't aim to scale up. If at all, they aim to help replicating or upnumbering, but not scaling, because the local level is the level they want to be at. And then we have this institutional entrepreneur. They explicitly challenge the existing system and are able to at least disrupt it or parts of it and create or maintain new institutions, new regulations, etc. And they do so explicitly. It's almost a normative element of their business model. And this type has a very distinct set of additional capabilities next to the sensing, conceptualizing, orchestrating, and scaling, stretching. And it's a type of transition competencies that I will go into more detail now. We are still very much in the process of mining our data, but based on both first empirical findings and a literature review, we already see how this type of institutional entrepreneurship is capable of applying the servitization skills, not only on the level of individuals and organizations, but also on this institutional level. And in addition, as an additional set of skills, so-called transition skills. So this type of entrepreneur has mastered the sensing skill very well, but has also very strong systems thinking and interpersonal skills. And because of that, they are able to collectively analyze complex systems across the domains, across skills. They are able to consider cascading effects, and they are able to build transition propositions, which also matter to society. So they are very well able to gain social acceptance and build on ongoing dialogues, and very often are also involved in creating a common vision at multiple levels. But they also master the conceptualizing skill, and in addition have anticipatory skills. So that's the ability to actually collectively analyze, evaluate, and craft rich pictures of the future, and then turn those into propositions that actually solve issues that are apparent in those future pictures. They are very well able to reconceptualize, so readjust, realign, and align very well with either laws and policies, or they are able to align policies and laws, regulations with their business model. So the conceptualizing takes place not only on the level of the business model, but also on the institutional level. They also master their orchestration skill and add a very strong normative skill to it. That means that they are able to collectively map and apply, reconcile, negotiate values, principles, goals, targets, etc. And these are all very important skills for constructing direction, one of the issues that is missing in the energy transition, and change orientation. So it very much allows for negotiation with the right people. They are engaged in political work because of this, are able to convince that the uptake of their business proposition will stimulate new laws and policies effectively. And then finally, they also have mastered the scaling skill and add that with add strategic skills to it. So they are not only able to collectively design and implement interventions, but they are also very able to help govern strategies towards sustainability. And because of this, their type of business models are very often effectively facilitated by new laws and policies. And their emergence also very often influences new business models and others to follow the flock. So to conclude, the business models that we see out there are very much shaped by institutions. But what we see now is that there is a very interesting type of business model out there that also not only is shaped by, but shapes institutions, shapes regulations, laws, etc. So what we can conclude is that the uptake of new business models not only depend on new institutional arrangements, but that new institutional arrangements also very much depend on the emergence of new type of business models that drive the energy transition. So these type of institutional entrepreneurs, they can very effectively create more favorable conditions for the rollout of their own business model. But as such, they don't only work for themselves, they very much pave the way. They pave the way in the sense that they are very important transition accelerators, both for the transition, but also creating business opportunities by demonstrating what's possible for other entrepreneurs that are less active on an institutional level, but still need to also start following to create change. And what we found is that to be able to disrupt these institutions and be an institutional entrepreneur, particular capabilities, so the dynamic capabilities, but also transition competencies are needed on multiple levels, both the level of individuals, organizations, but also institutional. And this is where the tricky part comes in, because the question is how much of these kind of capabilities are actually transferable, how much can be trained, and how much cannot be trained. So to conclude, what we are saying, based on the work so far, but again, it's work in progress, so there might be by the end of the project, somewhere around this time next year, a slightly different perspective. But what we think is that focusing on institutional entrepreneurship is a lens that actually helps us identify the valuable actors that can have significant impact on the energy transition and accelerating it. But it's also a lens that helps us identify where there are system pains that need to be resolved to get the following flock to also start become effective entrepreneurs in this energy transition. Here is the link to the project website at the User-Centered Energy Systems program. And the name of myself, Ruth Maurik, I'm the operating agent for this project, but also the names and the emails of all the others in their respective countries if you would like to contact us for further details or dialogue. That's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.